dream that one day, down in Alabama with its vicious racists,
the streets of America in the 1960s were restless. The air was thick with both hope and hatred, a nation torn between its promises of freedom and the cruel reality of segregation. In the South, signs reading "whites only" and "colored" hung above water fountains, bus seats, and restaurant doors, slicing the nation into two unequal worlds. African Americans lived as second-class citizens, denied basic dignity in the very land that boasted of liberty and justice for all. It was an era of contradictions. The United States stood proudly as a leader of democracy during the Cold War, projecting images of prosperity and fairness to the world, yet within its own borders, millions of its people were shackled by an invisible chain: discrimination, prejudice, and violence. Children of color walked to schools under police guard, their innocence pierced by jeers and insults. Entire neighborhoods were walled off by unwritten rules of race. To be black in America was to carry the daily weight of injustice. But in the middle of this storm, a voice began to rise. It was not the voice of an army general, nor a president, nor a wealthy industrialist. It was the voice of a Baptist preacher from Atlanta, Georgia. His name was Martin Luther King Jr., and his weapon was not a gun, but a dream. Martin Luther King Jr. was a man molded by both faith and fire. Born in 1929, he had grown up in the Deep South, where racial humiliation was a daily wound. Yet from the pulpit of his father's church, he learned the power of words, the rhythm of sermons, and the force of belief. To young Martin, faith was not just about saving souls, it was about saving society itself. By the time the 1960s arrived, Martin was no longer just a preacher. He had become the heartbeat of a movement. His voice carried through churches, city streets, and the steps of government buildings. He spoke not with the language of hate, but with the cadence of hope. "We will wear you down by our capacity to suffer," he proclaimed, echoing the philosophy of Gandhi. "We will not strike back with violence, but with love." It was a radical message in a country addicted to division. Police batons cracked skulls, dogs were unleashed on peaceful protesters, and yet Martin's movement marched on. To many, he was dangerous, not because he carried weapons, but because he carried ideas. Ideas that could dismantle centuries of oppression. The decade pulsed with images of fire hoses blasting children off their feet, of sit-ins at segregated diners, of buses burning in the night. And yet, it also pulsed with the sound of King's voice, a thunder that shook the conscience of the nation. His dream was simple, yet revolutionary, that one day, children of all races would walk hand in hand, judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The dream was fragile, threatened at every turn by bullets, bombs, and burning crosses. But it spread like wildfire, igniting hope, not just in America, but across the world. Martin Luther King Jr. had become more than a preacher. He was now the symbol of a generation's fight for dignity. Yet behind the hope, shadows gathered. For every cheer that greeted him, there was a threat whispered against him. For every march that lifted voices, there was a letter sent to silence him. In the land of freedom, speaking of equality had become a dangerous act, and so the stage was set. America was at a crossroads, one road leading toward unity, the other toward deeper division. At the heart of it all stood Martin Luther King Jr., a man with nothing but his faith, his words, and an unshakable dream. The dream had been spoken, and it had shaken America. But with every echo of Martin Luther King Jr.'s words, the walls of resistance grew taller. For every march of peace, there came a march of rage. For every candlelight vigil, there came the burning cross of the Ku Klux Klan. King had stood at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 and declared to the world, "I have a dream." His voice soared across the reflecting pool, reaching millions who watched on television. The speech etched him into history, but it also painted a target on his back. Those who upheld segregation, governors, sheriffs, mobs in white hoods, saw him not as a preacher, but as a threat. To them, his dream was a nightmare, a world where their power crumbled, their privileges erased. "We must resist at all costs," they muttered, and their resistance came with fists, fire, and bullets. The conflict escalated in the streets. Peaceful demonstrators knelt in prayer, only to be met with tear gas. Children marched for the right to learn and were shoved into police vans. The television cameras captured it all, beaming the brutality into the homes of ordinary Americans. Some were horrified, others cheered. America was at war with itself, and Martin Luther King Jr. was at the center. The government, too, grew uneasy. The FBI, under the iron hand of J. Edgar Hoover, labeled King as a dangerous radical. Wiretaps buzzed on his phones. Agents followed him, recording his every move, whispering rumors to discredit him. In secret memos, Hoover called him the most dangerous Negro in America. The preacher who preached love had become the state's most feared enemy. And yet King pressed on. In 1965, he led the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. The bridge was blocked by armed police. As King and his followers knelt in silent prayer, the officers advanced with clubs and gas. The world watched in horror as blood spilled across the asphalt. It became known as Bloody Sunday, but from that blood change began to bloom. Television images of the beatings shocked the conscience of the nation, forcing President Lyndon B. Johnson to push forward the Voting Rights Act. King had won a victory, but it came at a heavy price. Friends were jailed, churches were bombed, children were killed. The movement was alive but always under siege, and the conflict did not only come from the outside. Within the movement, new voices rose, voices that demanded a different path. Malcolm X had thundered about self-defense, warning that nonviolence was not enough. Younger activists, frustrated by the slow pace of change, began chanting "Black Power." To them, King's insistence on love seemed naive, even weak. King found himself caught in the crossfire. To the government, he was too radical. To the radicals, he was too moderate. And to his own heart, he was simply weary. Nights were sleepless. Days were filled with threats, letters promising death, phone calls dripping with hate. His children grew up under the shadow of fear, his wife Kreator carrying the burden of his mission as much as he did. But King was not only a fighter for civil rights at home. As the war in Vietnam raged, he could not stay silent. In 1967, he spoke out against the war, condemning America's violence abroad, even as it failed to heal its wounds at home. "Bombs in Vietnam explode at home," he declared. His words drew fire from all sides, politicians, media, even allies who warned him he was stretching too far. The dream was becoming heavier to carry. King began to feel not only the hatred of his enemies, but the betrayal of his friends. The more he spoke of poverty, war, and justice, the more isolated he became. His popularity waned, and yet his mission grew clearer. He was not only fighting for the black man in the South, he was fighting for the soul of humanity itself. By the late 1960s, America was burning. Riots tore through cities. The war claimed lives overseas and fueled unrest at home. King knew the path of peace was narrowing. Each speech he gave felt like it could be his last. Each march he led was shadowed by the whisper of assassination, and still he walked forward. If a man has not discovered something that he will die for, he isn't fit to live, he told his followers. It was not bravado, it was prophecy. King understood that his life was on borrowed time, and yet he refused to lay down the dream. The conflict of Martin Luther King Jr. was not only with the world outside, it was within himself, between the weight of fear and the light of faith, between the desire to protect his family and the duty to stand for justice, between the reality of hate and the vision of love. The man who dreamed was being tested by fire, and the world was watching to see if his dream would endure, or if hatred would finally snuff it out. The year was 1967 and America was trembling. Cities burned with riots. Soldiers died in the jungles of Vietnam. Hope and hatred clashed on every corner, and Martin Luther King Jr. walked through the fire, carrying a dream that seemed too fragile for such a violent world. He had marched through Selma, spoken against the war, and stood against the system that oppressed both black and poor alike. His voice still rang with power, but his shoulders carried the weight of a nation tearing itself apart. King's path was never safe. Death threats came daily. Letters dripped with venom. One morning, a package arrived at his home. Inside, a note urging him to take his own life. Signed with the letters FBI. Even the institutions sworn to protect him plotted in the shadows against him. And yet, King did not stop. "We must speak for those who have no voice," he told his followers. He traveled from city to city, his words like fire, igniting crowds, soothing wounds, stirring hope. Churches overflowed with people desperate to hear him, while others cursed his name. By this time, King had turned his focus to what he called the Poor People's Campaign. He saw clearly that the struggle was not only about race, it was about poverty, inequality, and the forgotten masses. Black, white, Latino, Native American. He called them all to march on Washington, not with anger, but with justice in their hearts. But the dreamer was growing tired. Friends noticed the lines deepening on his face, the shadows under his eyes. He confided to close allies, "I may not get there with you." It was not despair. It was foresight. King knew he was a marked man. Still, his faith carried him. In speeches, his voice thundered as if drawn from heaven itself. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. His words became mantras for millions who believed in something better. But not everyone shared the dream. In the streets of Chicago, King and his followers marched for fair housing. There, hatred was raw. Rocks and bottles flew from the crowd. Angry mobs screamed curses, their eyes full of rage. Later, King confessed, "I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and hate-filled as I've seen in Chicago." The opposition hardened. Segregationists and extremists called for his blood. Newspapers criticized him for opposing Vietnam. Even allies in the civil rights movement grew restless, believing his path too slow, too gentle. King stood in the middle of the storm, battered from all sides, but unwilling to abandon the dream. Then came 1968. Garbage workers in Memphis, Tennessee went on strike after years of mistreatment, dangerous conditions and starvation wages. Their signs were simple but powerful. "I am a man." King saw their struggle as part of the same battle he had fought all his life, the dignity of the human soul. He knew he had to go to Memphis. When he arrived, the city was tense. Police with batons lined the streets. Marchers carried signs and hopes in equal measure. As King walked among them, his presence lifted the air, like a shepherd walking among his flock. But the danger was closer than ever. A previous march had turned violent, with windows shattered and chaos in the streets. Critics claimed King's influence was waning. Enemies whispered that his time was over. The FBI watched from the shadows, keeping their files thick with every move he made. Still, King returned. Memphis was more than a strike. It was a test of the dream. If dignity could be won there, perhaps it could be won everywhere. He walked into Mason Temple on a stormy April night, the rain lashing against the windows, and delivered words that felt like prophecy. "I have been to the mountaintop," he said, his voice resonating like a bell through the hall. The crowd roared, but his tone carried something deeper, something final. He spoke of the promised land, of seeing the day when freedom would ring for all God's children. "I may not get there with you," he admitted, "but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." Those who heard him shivered. Some said later it was as if King knew his end was near. His face was calm, his spirit unshaken. He left the pulpit that night not with fear, but with peace, as though he had already accepted what fate was about to bring. The dream had carried him this far. The rising action of his life had led to this moment, a man standing at the edge of history, looking beyond his own life into a vision greater than himself. Memphis was waiting, the world was watching, and hatred was closing in, ready to strike. April 3rd, 1968. The storm clouds over Memphis had finally broken, drenching the city in rain that beat against the rooftops and trickled through the neon lights of Beale Street. Inside the Mason Temple, Martin Luther King Jr. had spoken words that would echo across time, his mountaintop speech, a sermon that sounded like both a farewell and a promise. The next morning, the rain had cleared, but the air was heavy, as though the city itself was holding its breath. King stayed at the Lorraine Motel, a modest place where civil rights leaders and organizers gathered. Its turquoise doors and white balconies stood in quiet contrast to the chaos of the world outside. Inside his room, King was weary. He had been carrying the weight of not only a movement, but an entire nation's conscience. His aides and friends urged him to rest, to stay cautious. Death threats were nothing new. They came by phone, by letter, even by whispers in the night. But in Memphis, the warnings felt sharper, closer, like a knife pressed against the skin. Andrew Young, Ralph Abernathy, Jesse Jackson, his brothers in the struggle, stayed close. They joked, played cards, and tried to lift the tension that clung to every corner. For a brief moment, King smiled again, his deep laughter filling the room like sunlight breaking through a storm. But outside, hatred moved in silence. A man named James Earl Ray lurked in the shadows, restless and cold. From a rented room across the street, he watched, waiting. The rifle in his hand was steady, his eyes locked on the figure who had become the symbol of a dream. As evening fell on April 4th, the Lorraine Motel grew quiet. Some staff moved about, cleaning rooms and preparing dinner. Children played nearby. On the second-floor balcony, King stepped out of his room, fresh from a conversation with his aides. He wore a dark suit, his presence commanding even in stillness. "Martin, don't forget your coat," someone called. The air was cool, a hint of spring. He smiled, waved it off. His gaze lifted to the horizon, where the last rays of sunlight stretched across the Memphis sky. And then it happened. A sharp crack split the air, louder than thunder. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Birds scattered from the rooftops. People froze, unsure if it was firecrackers or a backfiring car. But on the balcony, Martin Luther King Jr. collapsed, blood blossoming across his cheek, his body crumpling like a fallen oak. Screams filled the courtyard. Ralph Abernathy rushed forward, his hands trembling as he tried to lift his friend. Andrew Young yelled for help, his voice breaking with disbelief. They pointed frantically across the street toward the boarding house, where a shadow moved behind a curtain. On the ground below, people wept, some collapsing in grief. Jesse Jackson's shirt stained with his mentor's blood. The dreamer of peace, the preacher of nonviolence, had been struck down by a bullet of hate. The ambulance came, sirens wailing through the night. King was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, doctors fighting desperately to save him. But the wound was too grave, the damage irreversible. At 7:05 p.m., Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead. He was only 39 years old. News traveled like wildfire. Radios crackled with the announcement. Television screens flickered with solemn voices. Across America, a cry of anguish rose. In cities across the nation, Chicago, Washington, Baltimore, the grief turned to fire. Riots erupted, buildings burned, anger spilling into the streets. The very violence King had spent his life fighting against now consumed the land in his absence. Yet in some places, his spirit still guided. In Indianapolis, Senator Robert F. Kennedy stood before a grieving crowd, speaking extemporaneously from his heart. He invoked the words of the Greek poet Aeschylus, calling for compassion, not vengeance. His words, echoing King's legacy, kept the city from burning that night. Back in Memphis, silence gripped the Lorraine Motel. The balcony where King had fallen became a shrine, a place where people gathered in shock and sorrow. The bloodstains remained, a chilling reminder that even prophets could bleed. The nation mourned, but the loss was more than personal. It was spiritual. For many, it felt as if hope itself had been shot down. The dreamer was gone, and in his place, uncertainty and despair threatened to reign. But within the sorrow, something stirred. King's words, spoken the night before, rang in the hearts of millions. I may not get there with you, but we, as a people, will get to the promised land. It was as though he had seen beyond his own death, leaving behind a torch for others to carry. Funeral processions stretched across the South. Thousands walked behind the mule-drawn cart that carried his casket through the streets of Atlanta. Black and white, rich and poor, young and old, they marched in silence, honoring a man who had given everything for the dream of equality. The image of his widow, Coretta Scott King, veiled in black, walking with dignity and strength, became a symbol of resilience. Their children clutched her hands, innocent eyes wide with grief, yet bearing the legacy of a father who had changed the world. The climax of King's story was not just his death, it was the revelation of what he had planted. The bullet that killed him could not kill the movement. The voice that was silenced in Memphis continued to echo in marches, in songs, in classrooms, and in the hearts of generations unborn. The dream was wounded, but it was not destroyed. The man was gone, but the vision lived. And in that truth lay the deepest irony of all. Hatred tried to kill a nation's hope, but instead it made that hope immortal. The gunshot in Memphis silenced Martin Luther King Jr., but it could not silence his dream. Out of the blood-stained balcony at the Lorraine Motel rose a vision stronger than any bullet, a flame that hatred could not extinguish. In the days after his death, America mourned. Streets once filled with marches, now filled with weeping. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers lowered their heads in sorrow. It felt as if the heart of a nation had stopped beating. Yet amidst the grief, something remarkable unfolded. King's words, once carried by his voice alone, now belonged to millions. His dream became their dream. Churches filled with hymns of hope, communities organized, and young people declared that his fight would continue. The Poor People's Campaign he had envisioned went forward, though he was not there to lead it. Across Washington, tents rose in a symbolic resurrection city, a reminder that the struggle was larger than any one man. Though the campaign faced setbacks, its very existence testified to the idea that King's vision could not be buried. Coretta Scott King, his widow, emerged as a symbol of strength. With quiet dignity, she carried his message to the world. Standing before crowds, she he reminded them that the cause of justice was not over, that the dream lived on through action, courage, and love. In the years that followed, the United States began to bend slowly toward the justice King had spoken of. Laws changed, schools integrated, opportunities expanded. The road was far from easy. Racism and inequality persisted, but the foundation had been laid, cemented by the sacrifice of a man who had dared to dream aloud. And across the globe, Martin Luther King Jr. became more than an American figure. He became a universal symbol of nonviolence, of courage, of the belief that love is stronger than hate. Leaders in South Africa, in Eastern Europe, in Asia, all drew inspiration from the preacher from Atlanta who had faced death with unshakable faith. But perhaps the greatest part of King's legacy was not in governments or institutions, but in the hearts of ordinary people. A child reading his words in school, a protester holding a sign that echoes his call for justice, a family choosing forgiveness over bitterness. In these small acts, his dream lives, shaping the world in ways unseen. The moral of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life is both simple and profound. Hatred may kill a man, but it cannot kill a vision rooted in truth. Violence may end a voice, but it cannot end the song of justice once it has begun to echo. King himself foresaw it. In his final speech, he declared, "I've been to the mountaintop,
and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land." His words were not prophecy of despair, they were words of triumph.
For though his eyes closed in Memphis, his dream opened the eyes of generations yet to come. And so when we look back on Martin Luther King Jr., we do not see only a man felled by hatred. We see a dreamer whose vision outlived him, a shepherd whose flock still marches, a leader whose moral compass still points true north. The dream did not die on April 4th, 1968. It lives in every act of courage, in every stand for justice, in every voice that refuses to be silenced, because dreams, when rooted in love and justice, are immortal.